Hello, Dr. Ibby.
Hello, Dr. Joe.
How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. I've just been thinking about people, designing games for social simulation, which just happens to be the name of a talk that we looked at recently. And they're going to talk about a little bit on this show and I guess try and apply some of the ideas in it. Yeah, and for context, if you've never listened to the show before, Ibby here is a linguist, and I'm a game designer, but I sort of was a cultural studies person years and years ago, so we're both academics and also gamers, and that's why we're doing this show, which is a show all about games, language, and culture.
So, do you want to introduce this talk that we listened to for today's episode?
Yeah, there's various versions of this talk available online. There's a version on gamedeveloper.com, and you can kind of watch it, or you can look at the slides. So I think we're going to go through the main points of the talk very roughly, but I know that people are really interested will go and want to watch it themselves. But this is kind of an interesting piece by a designer called Mitu Khandaker, and she's given various talks on a similar subject, but this is kind of her thinking around a particular topic that she was designing around, because she designed a game some time ago called Redshirt, which is a social simulation, and if you're familiar with Star Trek, the Redshirts in Star Trek are like the lower level kind of grunts of the Starship Enterprise who just die whenever they go on missions, right? It's kind of a social sign for being a background character, and the game is kind of playing on that, and it's kind of got a system in it where, well, the whole game is based around Facebook. So you have a system called Spacebook. Haven't played this yet, just seen kind of screenshots, but maybe play it for my YouTube channel at some point. It does look quite interesting. You play it all through this Spacebook interface, and the game is effectively about building up social capital with different characters, you know, sharing gossip with them and all of this kind of stuff. So in order to kind of explain what she's doing in this game and her thinking around this game, she takes us through this concept of what is social simulation, what is a social simulator, and there is kind of a distinction here between, you know, social simulator as a genre of games that exists or can exist, and social simulation as a thing which happens to varying degrees in different types of games. And most of the talk is kind of taking us through that of when is a game more or less of a social simulator. And I thought this would be an interesting topic for us to look at. And I know that this isn't necessarily directly related to your research, but I know that in your research you deal with kind of conflict and negotiation,
social interactions. Yes. So I found it a very interesting talk, and obviously I don't have a game design background, right? I'm a casual gamer. I don't know anything about how games are made, right? I don't know anything about the back end at all. But what was very, and you know, if you ask me what is a social sim in the context of a game, I would probably say it's a game genre, right? But what was very interesting about her general definition is that, as far as I understood it, she doesn't really think of it as a genre. She thinks of it as a feature of a game, I think.
Yeah.
So at the very beginning of her talk, she asks this question, you know, what's a social sim? And she gives a very broad definition. If I can just read that very quickly, it's anything that allows social interactions with or between NPCs to meaningfully affect the outcome of a situation. And so I think there are two key points that are quite interesting here. One is that it's a social interaction that the player has with NPCs, and also that those social interactions have a meaningful effect on the situation, right? So would you agree that that doesn't really describe a genre strictly? It's just a feature of, or a mechanic of something that a game can do.
Yeah. So, I mean, to give the extreme example, and it's an example that she uses throughout the talk, The Sims is kind of almost entirely this. There were other elements of the game, like building the house, decorating the house, but in terms of the way that people work in The Sims, it is kind of pure social simulation. And the thing that's key is the NPCs having enough autonomy to be able to interact with each other in a way that's actually, you know, part of the program of the game. And it's not just something that's inferred in the background. Like, you know, in Dragon Age, you go to the bar and two characters are already there, and that implies they had a conversation while you're out of the room, right? But that conversation isn't happening and doesn't have different outcomes. It's not really there. It's something you kind of make up in your own imagination. Whereas in a social simulation, you have potential interactions between characters that the player has no control over. And that means that you can have games that are entirely built around this, or it can be a feature of other games. And you know what Mitu Khandaker goes into this talk in quite a lot of depth is why this isn't more common, I guess, and like why other games don't do this so much. And we start off with quite early in the talk of kind of social and technological reasons why we don't, or cultural and technological reasons why we don't get that. So one example is that we don't have the equivalent of middleware for social interactions in games. And by middleware, I mean things like you get a piece of software that goes in your game engine that makes another part of developing the game easier. And the example she uses is a physics engine, right? So in a physics engine, we have a general kind of simulation of how physics works,
right,
and how mass, for example, or how the texture of something might impact how it rolls, all of those things. And because physics between games is largely going to be the same, unless, you know, you might have a very cartoony game and you change some variables and things are more bouncy, right? But generally speaking, most games can run off the same physics engine because we know what we want it to do, and we know what interactive situations we want it to be able to handle. We know that it's mostly going to be about making things fall down.
Yeah, it's mostly gravity related, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I suppose that comes down to the nature of the thing, right? Physicists can look at a thing and they generally agree on lots and lots of things about how physics works. Whereas simulating something social is something that, you know, even people that have been writing about this for 100 years don't necessarily agree on things like social psychology and how people behave and what motivates people. And so even if there was more of a desire to make, I guess, soap opera games that were purely about human interaction, we don't have these tools like the equivalent of a physics engine to make it easier. We have it for physics, but we don't have it for things like human emotion and human interaction. And I think a lot of that, as we're going to get into with the examples, a lot of it comes down to, you know, what is the player trying to do in these situations, and does having autonomous characters with their own wants and needs actually play into that?
So it's very interesting that you say you don't have that for social interactions or emotions, but I would assume because there are games that do have some degree of autonomous social simulation that they have written that code. But is it then just a matter of that's not a tool that's shared or publicly available?
Right, exactly. Okay. Or it's something that, again, she calls it the Photoshop problem, or the Photoshop challenge, which comes from Chris Hecker and Richard Evans, which is this idea that the thing is not standard enough for there to be a standard tool.
Right.
Whereas, you know, with Photoshop, it's like, you know what photoshopping something is. It's like become a verb. And the same with kind of like, to a degree with physics, it used to be Havoc. It's not necessarily the only physics engine anymore. But yeah, when people are creating these behavioral systems, whether it's a tree or some other way of modeling the AI of a character, they're not necessarily transferring those between games. And some of that will be to do with it being proprietary technology. Right. And some of it will be to do with it just not necessarily transferring easily to another game, because who's to say what part of a kind of character's social AI is going to be relevant to a different system? You know, like, you might create a really good thing for modelling jealousy, and then that works really well in a love triangle situation in a dating game, and it doesn't have any impact in another game.
So you would need some kind of tool that is extremely broad and can potentially model all kinds of things, and then you would be able to turn off certain aspects of that, or turn some on, depending on what kind of game you would want to make, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And it's sort of a chicken or egg situation, because I think lots of people would say, well, the reason we don't have this tool is because people don't want this sort of game, right? The people who want The Sims play The Sims, which is like the ultimate kind of interactive doll's house, and that sort of absorbed all the people that want that sort of game, and no one wants variations of that sort of game. I don't necessarily think that's true, but it kind of becomes this chicken or egg thing of like, do we not have the tool because people don't want the game, or would we have more kind of desire for this thing if it was easier to make, and we were making more and experimenting more with it? And so just to kind of go through the main points of the talk, we kind of get this dichotomy, where it's initially presented as a dichotomy, and then, as is always the case in talks with dichotomies in, it becomes
more complicated.
It becomes
than
a spectrum, and then it becomes a 2D model. And but we have at one end we have social simulations where characters have autonomous behaviour, and the example here is The Sims. And then at the other end we have narratives which are authored branching. So the example is the Walking Dead Telltale game here. And as we step through, we'll find there are examples in the middle, which, a really good recent example of something that's in the middle would be something like Baldur's Gate 3, where you have all of the game is all of the narrative, all the dialogue is created through branching, authored script that someone has written, but there are points in that where a character's reaction to what you do or say is going to be inflected by things that they remember. Now, characters do have memory in Telltale games, but the level of complexity that's going on in Baldur's Gate is way, way higher. So
Carlock did not like that.
Yeah. But I mean, it's stuff as simple as like, you might pick up an object a character doesn't like, and that hurts your reputation with them. And then, but I guess if you were to push that more in the direction of a social simulation, it would be things like, Shadowheart reacts even worse to the thing you did or said because she's hungry right now, right?
That sounds very much like a Shadowheart thing to do.
Yeah. You're not you when you're hungry. Was that a Snickers advert? Snickers? If you were to push Baldur's Gate 3 entirely into social simulation territory, or further into it, where the NPCs have autonomous behaviour, things like, Shadowheart and Astarion have had a tiff in the camp. Completely, you don't even know about it, and that is impacting stuff in the story, and you have to go and talk to them and like make them make friends again, right? That's the sort of thing, and we do see that in the story. We see like Lae'zel and Shadowheart have a rivalry in the story. Spoilers for the first like hour and a half of Baldur's Gate 3 if you haven't played it. But that is purely authored, and it's always going to happen, and it's kind of it's going to trigger at different times for people, but it's not happening as a result of simulation that is causing these characters to dislike each other, and then for that dislike to develop into a rivalry. That's just kind of something that the kind of script writers have created from scratch. And again, what was quite interesting for me as, again, someone who knows nothing about game design, was that, again, both the sort of emergent Sims end of the spectrum and the scripted, like the Walking Dead games end of the spectrum, she considers both of those social simulation, because, again, in both cases you have social interaction that has an effect on the situation. But she basically takes those two ends of the spectrum as what she calls the potential approaches to the problem of social sims. So, and she also says, interestingly, it's not that either of those is more valid or valuable than the other. It's more a question of, what is your game about? What do you want your game to do? And then therefore do you go more with the sort of autonomous behaviour emergent situation end, or
are you going with scripted branching dialogue trees, basically.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that even the more popular games that fit on that more autonomous end of the spectrum. So there are kind of some recent colony management games. There was one called RimWorld, which is, you know, managing a colony of people in space and all their interactions and stuff. And that seems to really appeal to people when they're not playing a single character in the world, right?
Okay.
When you're playing a single character in the world, it becomes a power fantasy. That's your avatar. That's kind of you in the world. And you tend to get sort of RPGs where you've got a dialogue tree, and you know the classic Bethesda one in particularly in the Fallout ones is there's an option in the dialogue tree that is like you're being the heroic good neighbor, you're being Lucy from the TV show, right? There's an option that is kind of a pragmatic mercenary, I'll do it for more money kind of option.
Yeah.
And then there's a total like D-bag option where you're just like really mean for no reason. And there might be some other like contextual questions and stuff, but a lot of the time it breaks down to those, and it's like the game is telegraphing, even by like the order that they appear in the menu, it's kind of telegraphing what outcome you're going to get from those sorts of things as well, of like you know how it's going to impact your reputation and how people think about you generally, and whether what kind of character you're building generally.
Yeah, I just remember, and I don't know what game it was, but I remember playing a game in the last 2 years or so where I remember you read what the dialogue option will be, you select it, and then what they say isn't actually what was written there, and you couldn't tell from what was written that...
Was it Inquisition? Inquisition was quite a lot like that.
It might have been.
Because they had little symbols. You know, if you were picking the romantic option, it was a heart, and then there'd be a symbol to like shout at someone.
No, it wasn't that. Then it was something that didn't clearly indicate what was actually going to happen if you picked something. Because I picked something that sounded like, or read like, oh, this is going to be the diplomatic option, and then what they said wasn't actually what was written.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't the diplomat option, so that was but I can't remember what game that was.
And that can be a good thing if a game is constantly doing that.
Yeah.
If the game has set up a design pattern where you nearly always can predict, and then suddenly it throws you a curveball like that, then it's really confusing, right? And we get this kind of more authored, predictable branching in a lot of games that are meant to be power fantasies.
Yeah.
And the games that do have this more doll's house, you know, watch the characters interact, see what they do, tend to be games that put us in a more managerial position, right? Like The Sims or RimWorld, any of these games. They're not putting us in the world to interact with these unpredictable characters, and that's what Redshirt attempts to do from everything we saw in this talk. There are some other examples here, and she goes back to a game called Gossip, which I think was 1983, which was one of Chris Crawford's games. He comes up a few times in this talk. He's like the founder of the GDC, and he famously kind of left the games industry at the GDC talk with a strange ramble about Don Quixote and running out of the room with a sword, which is, you know, man after my own heart.
It's not like any of the conferences I've ever been to.
Yeah, you were getting conference jealousy about that talk. But this is a cool little game. It's like kind of like the board game Dream Phone.
Yes.
Where you pick up and you interact with you get gossip about who likes you and stuff, and then you do a process of elimination. This is kind of, it's not the same, but it's the same vibe of you have characters and you choose who to phone up, and they tell you about other characters and they tell you about their relationships. And that's kind of like an example of this kind of the game is just about these characters' relationships, and presumably they're different at the start as well. So it's not like... and one of the things I thought of a moment ago when you were saying that you don't necessarily know what's going on under the hood in these games, you might not be able to like look at a Baldur's Gate 3 or look at a Walking Dead and know where they fall on this spectrum.
Yeah.
But I think where it would emerge to you was if you played a bunch of these games multiple times.
And then you can see if things repeat or if my decisions make a difference or not, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you could load up... I mean, I'm not sure that's how saves work in The Sims, but you could load up the same household on The Sims on day one, and then play it again and play it again and again, and the relationships would develop differently.
Yeah.
Perhaps with no not even based on stuff you're doing, just based on stuff that's happening between the characters. Whereas some, like the relationships in a Red Dead or any more mainstream game where the player is put in this kind of hero role, generally speaking, if there's branching dialogue and you choose the same options, you're going to get the same outcomes, unless you kind of do something that triggers a little flag that says, Shadowheart didn't like you, throwing her statue of Shah in the lava or
I would never do that. I would never do that to her.
And I mean, a couple of the other games she briefly mentions Dwarf Fortress, which a lot of people listening to this will know of. It's kind of a legendary game for how complex it is in this way, even among people who haven't played it. She's put it right off the chart on the autonomous behaviour side. And then Shadow of Mordor is on there because they kind of famously have this thing where you sort of develop an antagonistic relationship with a particular orc. So if you think back to like the idea of bosses in games, you get a recurrent boss of this orc that has been kind of procedurally generated. So they have a random name like Fred the Meanie Greenie or something. I mean, they're not green in they're grey, the Uruk-hai, but it sort of develops over time, right? And it's procedural, so they might learn what skills and weapons you use and develop counterattacks for it and all of that kind of stuff. And I think they develop they have interactions with each other, so there's infighting with the orcs, and it kind of really brings them to life in this way that makes them feel like orcs, right? Yeah. Rather than skeletons or something that doesn't. The thing about orcs and how they're portrayed in various media, and I remember Warhammer used to do this, they could just randomly get in fights with each other on the battlefield, and so your army would start eating itself because they're so chaotic in that sense. So yeah, that's kind of cool. And I think the other two things to focus on here, when she's talking about like what you get out of these different approaches. So on the autonomous behaviour side, we get a higher degree of emergence, right? Which is, and you hear people talk about this in game design a lot. It's not necessarily just related to the social. It can be things like, just mechanics interacting in strange ways that produce things happening in the world that you didn't expect, and sometimes that can be player driven, like maybe a game lets you put a plastic explosive on a car and then you drive that in a place and it explodes at a funny time and something happens and it sets off a chain of actions. That's emergence, when we get things coming out of the game that we don't expect because of
things
how
that aren't
complex
scripted, basically,
things
right?
that aren't scripted, exactly. And we get, with that high degree of emergence, what you get in a kind of social game is a higher degree of a chance of delight and amusement for the player, right? As a player aesthetic, and that's because the game is doing things that they don't expect, they don't anticipate. Maybe even the programmers didn't think to put it in, and it just happens. And I can't remember if it was in this talk or if it's just something I saw on Twitter last week. There was an example of the Sims and the
death and the baby.
So someone in the Sims is giving birth, and the Grim Reaper shows up to take someone away. Someone else has died. And the Grim Reaper responds to the childbirth like any other character in the game would, and basically starts going, "Oh my god," and freaks out, which is so funny. That's like the Grim Reaper in The Sims is suddenly the Grim Reaper from Terry Pratchett, right? So, because in The Sims we were an outside observer and we're watching it like a soap opera or Big Brother reality TV thing. Rather than seeing these characters behave in unpredictable ways and kind of being annoyed with it because, they're supposed to be our friend on an epic adventure who's helping us out and they're doing daft stuff, it's actually kind of creating a really enjoyable thing because of the way that we're positioned in relation to it, to just observe it and note when something unusual happens, right? And then the other end of the spectrum, when we've got a much more authored branching narrative like in The Walking Dead, you get a higher degree of emotional nuance because everything is deliberate and everything is written by writers. So you get things like, stories that are set up to pay off in a particular way, and characters that keep secrets because they can keep secrets because the writer can sort of know something about that character that doesn't become pertinent until later on and all of that, and that is going to lead to a higher degree of emotional involvement. And I mean, if you look at something like Baldur's Gate, the majority of the fandom for that game really like that aspect of it. They like the fact that these characters are very heavily authored. They're very emotionally involved with those characters. But you can play with none of those characters. You can just banish them all.
Yeah.
Just have a bunch of blank slate characters. But then because there aren't any mechanics to have the characters just interact directly like they would in The Sims, you basically then get characters that don't speak at all.
Yeah. So that's sort of the autonomous versus authored branching narrative distinction. But then more generally, she lists sort of 6 important considerations for designing social sims.
Yep.
And the autonomous versus authored is just the first of them. And basically, it's just, again, she says, none of these are inherently better or more social simmy than the other. It's just when you design a game, you have to make certain decisions, and ideally you want them to be, purposeful and meaningful situations that add something to your game. And the autonomous versus authored is one. And then the second one sort of links back to what I said earlier, my memory of that game that I can't remember, that didn't tell me what was going to happen. Is the second one is having to do with how do you communicate, or how does the game communicate to the player what the effect is of your choices, and what happens with the relationships between the player character and NPCs, or between NPCs, which is quite interesting. And again, you said in Baldur's Gate 3 we get that Karlach didn't like that.
And one of this is kind of surprising that she kind of has this stance on it, but she basically says it's good to have an overt thing in the UI that tells you that someone doesn't like you or whatever. Even though that's not socially realistic, it kind of puts the player's focus on that game variable existing. And we've seen, a game that went really hard on making you read people's facial expressions was L.A. Noire, which was a noir detective game built on the GTA 4 engine by a different studio a few years ago. And it was very, very good. It had very good facial acting, but even then it was quite difficult to... it's not a skill that people are used to using in the context of video games. And then, there are people that don't have that skill and can't do that anyway.
Even outside of...
So it's not fun to do that in a game. So actually explicitly having that variable and having it exposed to tell you that so-and-so doesn't like you. And obviously there are degrees of doing that. You can have so-and-so seems upset with me and then not explicitly tell you why. Mitu Khandaker basically says, if you want this to be the focus of your game, then you need to foreground it, and you need to let players know. Just like games that are about combat have a health bar. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You might show that the character is beaten up, and they might go, "Oh," but we still have a health bar.
You wouldn't have a game where there's combat going on, but there is no health bar, and you have to sort of guess whether you're about to die or not.
And I heard a UI designer describe this once as, the purpose of UI is to pump variables that exist in the game to the surface of the game so that it can be perceived by players. And she's talking about the social equivalent of that. And even if you don't play any of these strange experimental games like The Sims, right? Even if you only play AAA blockbuster RPGs, you will still have seen some version of this in these kind of, you go into your party menu. The Dragon Age games had it as well. And you go into the party menu and people have different levels of reputation with you, or it might be loyalty.
And sometimes it's not individuals, it's entire groups of people in a game. It might be like, oh, in this city, this is your reputation, and therefore people will give you better prizes when you trade, or they, are going to be more suspicious of you, or whatever it might be. So it's not necessarily on an individual basis. It might be entire, like a society-wide thing, or, you might be wanted in one area of the map because you did some crime, but you're okay in a different area, and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
And then,
so we've got the trade-off between the autonomous and the authored.
Yeah.
We've got how much is communicated to the player, And then the third one is quite interesting.
And I think the third one really links to the sixth one. And those are the two ones that I found quite interesting.
Yeah, the third one sounds like it's an ethical consideration, but I think it's actually more about crafting a particular type of experience.
Exactly. I think the question is, to what degree does my game treat NPCs as ends rather than means, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's probably a spectrum, right? Where am I putting that? And that, I think, links, as I said, to the last point, which is the primacy of social interaction mechanics in a game. Mm-hmm. To what degree is the social interaction the main thing about my game, or is it something that's secondary, right?
So the ends versus means thing would be, in the game, you're making friends with the character because it's fun to make friends with the character.
Yeah.
And the friction that arises from that is fun, and that's the focus of the game. You're not making friends with them because they get a special move when you get their friendship thing all the way up, right? Or you get to see them naked or something like that, which is how a lot of games treat these sort of meters.
Yeah. This is sort of where my linguistic hat put itself on. And, where I was thinking about questions that communication studies scholars and linguists ask, like, what are the functions of language and what are sort of broad goals that people have when they communicate? Why do people communicate? And that, I think, to some degree, that maps really nicely to the question, why does a game developer let you interact with an NPC as a player, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the purpose of that?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into it here. I think I'm going to go into it a little bit more in the blog post.
Uh-huh.
There are all kinds of models that people have come up with as to sort of main functions of language and main purposes of communication. But I think, and I was thinking about this a little bit in the context of games, and I think there are at least 4 that I think are quite dominant. And the first one is probably just to transfer information, right? To get more information about the world that you're in as a player. That might be, lore dumping, for instance, or, getting information about NPCs. And interesting, that function isn't necessarily one where you have to have your player interact with an NPC. Your player can pick up a book and it gives you loads of information about the world.
Although that book is still implied that was written by a character in the world, right?
So but it's not a form of social interaction, right? Yeah. Then the second one is, why do you interact with people? It's to transfer goods, right? Trading, that kind of stuff. So you go to your trader and you give them your little coins and they give you some swords. And then the third one, which this is, I think, where we have slight differences between, real life functions of communication versus in-game functions, but they are interestingly connected. So you can imagine in the real world, you communicate with people because you are trying to get future actions going, to direct people to do something or help you do something. So it's not just about transferring information, but it's about doing things together, right?
We should hang out sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what's quite interesting is that in a lot of ways, I would say game developers let the player interact with characters in order to get the player to do certain actions, right? So to start quests and get you to go and chop that tree down, because otherwise you might not do it, right? So the whole starting quests and ending quests and getting the hero on a journey, that kind of thing, right? So it's not to do necessarily just with information or with trading, but with triggering actions. And not so much I'm approaching you because I want you to do something, but as a player I'm made to approach this NPC because the game developer wants me to do a thing, right? So it's the game triggering the player into taking certain actions, which is quite interesting.
You get this very kludgy version of this where someone posted a joke about it online where it was my favourite song in Zelda is when this character comes up to you and they say, please hear the song of my people, and then it's got musical marks, and it's like, to use a bomb, press B, and they're like singing the tutorial at you.
Okay.
You've got like quest givers in traditional folklore tales, right?
Yeah.
Which is where we get like the hero's journey theory, and where we get like the stuff that comes from the Russian folklorists. So it's like a function within a story of the quest giver. But because games are so often, a player character has a degree of free reign, and then they need to be told what to do by the game, and it's more interesting or involving for a character to tell you what to do than for the game to just abstractly tell you what to do. So to some degree, those characters are doing a double role of being a character in the world and also doing what like the instruction manual in a physical game would do. And like if you take that to the most kind of literal version, it's like when you play an MMO, you play World of Warcraft or you play Elder Scrolls Online, you can tell which characters serve that function because they've got a big exclamation mark above their head. Right?
Unlike in real life.
Yeah. You don't go into like an office and the manager has a thing above their head.
I feel like that would be very scary if you go into the office and your manager has a big exclamation mark. It's like,
yeah, it's like we need to talk.
Yeah.
But like visibly. I think what you're talking about as well is sort of maps on a little bit to like what is a character, because when we talk about characters, it's like characters aren't people, they're representations of people, and they're created through the process of characterization, which is giving them characteristics, right? And depending on a game and the focus of the game, you'll get characters that feel more or less like people because they have more or less characteristics. And at the end of the spectrum where the characters are purely functional and they're not meant to, you've got things like in like JRPGs, like Japanese style RPGs like Pokemon, or a lot of the older Final Fantasy games. You have a town, it's peppered with people, you walk up to them and they have one line to say. And they say like, I love the market, I love the smell of the bread. And then you come back 7 days later and they're standing there and they say the same thing. And they're effectively like a sign, like in the sense that they just never change. And then you've got versions of that that are a bit more sophisticated, like Stardew Valley, where characters generally say the same thing, but then there might be different contexts where they say different things, and the kind of more complex the characters get, the more characteristics they have, the more likely they are to move away from one of those very strict functions of I'm just here to give you information or I'm just here to give you something to do, to I guess what we were talking about here, if the characters are people for their own sake rather than to serve the ends of you are on a quest and you're going to become powerful and stuff.
So that's the sort of the fourth main function. So I've had the first one, transfer information, second, transferring goods, the third one, getting actions going, and then the fourth one being managing social relations, right? And this is a very linguistic thing to say, the cool thing about language and communication is that when we communicate with other people, we usually do multiple of those things at the same time, right? So when you go, and the same applies here, you go to an NPC, they might give you a quest, right? So getting you to do a thing. But usually that comes with some kind of information about the world. Like, my poor daughter has been abducted by a dragon, right? So you get some information and there's a call to action. And then to some degree, there might be relationship building or there might be underlying social sims going on in the game as well, right? And the same applies to real life. Whatever we do, the relationship we have with that person always impacts how we interact with them and the other way around, right? How we interact with people constantly impacts that relationship. And so I think with regard to this talk, the question is, to what degrees does a game do those different things? Or to what degrees do game designers put characters in a game, and what do they let the player do with their own character, right? What are the sort of limits and affordances? Do they put in an NPC just to give you a quest? Or is there more than that, right?
And it can be really uncanny as well if a game builds up a particular set of expectations about
Yeah.
what characters are and do, and then breaks it.
Yeah.
You know, so if you did have a game where all of the characters have one line to say, and then you suddenly meet a character that has a lot more to say and is like
Yeah.
suddenly like 3,000% more of a character than anyone else you've met.
Which
in the game.
makes me
It's very
think
strange.
of Graveyard Keeper and the donkey in Graveyard Keeper. Who you think? So in Graveyard Keeper, you play. It's a sort of Stardew Valley kind of style game, and
you'd be forgiven for thinking it's a rip-off because it looks like a pure farming simulator, but then it is
the farm
themed
is the
around.
graveyard, and you're meant to embalm corpses and all of that kind of stuff, and you get corpses brought by this donkey, but it turns out the donkey speaks and actually.
Well, it leaves you notes.
No, I think he speaks, doesn't he?
I can't remember.
And well, he communicates with you either way,
yeah.
in some either verbally or in written form. And turns out the donkey is a communist, and then at some point he goes on strike and refuses to bring you any more corpses unless you give him more carrots, which I think is great negotiating.
Yeah, I think the developers of that may be from Russia. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe an ex-Soviet country.
Yeah.
I couldn't work out where the satire was supposed to be landing with that. So it's going to be like, you know, Disco Elysium, where people are endlessly arguing about how cynical it is about its portrayal of left-wing ideas. But yeah, the donkey is very funny because it's just it shouldn't be a character, and then gradually becomes more and more of a character and is more intensely a character than a lot of the other characters in the game that, again, just say one line a lot of the time when you speak to them. We've got a few more examples. I mean, she talks a little bit about Crusader Kings, which is a game that is, you know, to some degree a sort of historical military simulator, but there is a lot in it of relationships between characters, because it's a game about dynasties, which is like kind of, you know, the soap opera of history, and depending on where you're from and how history is taught, that's kind of all we learn about history. I mean, the dominant mode of teaching history when I was a kid at school was still this kind of you know, they call it a great men model of history, where, you know, it's obviously great men and women, because it's not just Henry VIII, it's also, you know, which women did he murder to satisfy his strange whims about parentage and so on. But that's like most of what we get in the British education system about history is just this kind of soap opera of who were the kings and queens. Occasionally you might learn about a turbulent priest, or some member of the clergy that did something naughty, or maybe a prime minister, but it's all just like, you know, who are these important people and what are their relationships to each other, which is kind of a lot of what's going on in Crusader Kings. You know, you might be assassinated by your cousin because they don't like your stance on a particular religious thing or whatever.
I have a question, and this might put you on the spot. So in the talk, obviously, all the games she talks about are video games. But can you think of games that are board games or card games that have aspects of social sim in it?
It's an interesting question, because, I mean, all of the things that we're talking about are where you are simulating the characters rather than, you know, players interacting with each other through a game. And, you know, there's a big category of analog games that are about social interaction as the main mechanic. So Werewolf or Mafia, it's like the game purely exists to give something for players to experience lying and bluffing, you know. Whereas you've got, like, say, poker, where bluffing is a game mechanic in poker. It's a skill that you can have in poker, and it's reading people's bluff is a skill you can have in poker, but it's not the entire game, whereas something like Werewolf or Mafia is all about lying and detecting lies and making arguments about people's lies and so on. But that's not a game where, you know, like these examples where there is a sort of personality being simulated by the game itself. There are definitely games of that nature. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a game that was all about a character's brain and different players pushing for different things to happen based on which part of the personality they represented. And, you know, obviously with role-playing games as well, the DM has a set of NPCs, and sort of has to predetermine or improvise how resistant they might be to particular things.
Yeah.
So in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, if you meet a particular character and you want them to do something for you, you've got mechanics to directly interact with that. You've got persuasion, you've got intimidation that you might be stronger at if you're big and ugly or something.
Yeah.
And you've got the
Charm?
equivalent of that would fall under persuasion, but there are kind of skills that are to do with lying, like performance and stuff like that as well, or like pretending something isn't as it is. And then the DM, who is effectively, you know, playing the role of a computer, and this is why people like things like D&D so much, is that, you know, the DM can have their authored narrative that they want to deliver, but they are also improvising all the time, which it might not make it a simulation as such, but, you know, if they are playing it quote unquote right or by the book, then they will say, okay, this is a character that is you know, very tough and not easily scared, but they really love their dog, right? And so if the character say, oh, I'm going to intimidate this character, okay, you might say, oh, that's a difficulty of 18, you've got to beat a roll of 18 to intimidate them. But if they say, we're going to threaten this character's dog, right, then they might make that role easier.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what makes those games so compelling, because the DM can kind of read the character they're playing and adjust these variables on the fly.
Yeah.
And if you think back to that silly example from earlier with Baldur's Gate 3 and like the characters behaving differently because they're hungry or they've fallen out.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing you can do on the fly in a tabletop role-playing game. But I can't think of many examples of kind of more straight board games or tabletop games that are about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I remember you told me about maybe like a dating... Was it a dating game, a dating card game or board game? But I don't know to what degree that would be.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of Fog of Love.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting game because it's effectively, you know, you sit down with another person. It's a brilliant spectator sport. It's very interesting to watch two people play because you kind of build a character each and then you play through these scenarios where you play as the characters interacting, and the scenarios are sort of set up to work like a rom-com or a romantic drama where they sort of start you off with the meet cute, and then as the plot develops you might hit things that are deliberately designed to cause stumbling blocks in your relationship, like, you know, conflicts of aspiration and stuff like that. But the thing that's really interesting in that, and the guy who designed it, I think he kind of went down a big rabbit hole of trying to model all of these behavioural things that people actually do. So your characters have sort of hidden desires that they are trying to fulfill.
Right.
And they have particular personality traits where at the end of the game your character will end up more or less happy depending if they've behaved in a particular way throughout. So they might be an introvert and that means they should do this type of thing and not this type of thing to become happy. But they will also have like a secret thing that determines basically whether they want to be as happy as their partner or more or less happy than them.
Interesting.
So you might have you might be playing a character with a particular personality type where they want to dominate the other character and to be happier and more well off than them at the end of the game, which is like kind of disturbing, but it is also a thing that
people do.
A thing that drives drama in stories as well. So that's interesting. It's less of a social simulation because the characters that are being simulated are being puppeteered by these two players, but the variables that are there and the part of the game and part of the way that the players are motivated to play are the sort of like underlying simulation of the bit of your character that you can't control.
So obviously there's going to be slightly different limits and affordances if you have a tabletop game compared to a video game. Yeah,
and in this example it's less about, you know, the game is simulating a character and more that the game is creating a character by giving you particular goals. Right? You are playing a character who is very outgoing and wants to meet lots of people, and you will win the game if you conform more to this character, which is like there's a big thing in game design of like the goals of a game can dramatically change how you play. Right? Like where the end point is in the game and what you do to score a point in the game. You can take the same things that you're doing moment to moment in the game, but that context change completely changes everything, right? It's like if you give people a boxing match and you have conventional scoring and everything, and then you have another boxing match and you say there are 3 rounds and you only have 3 minutes for each round, then people will expend their energy differently. They'll behave in a different way strategically, and what that game does is give you kind of very few mechanics to actually use in the gameplay, and it's all about, the game is trying to force you to play this character by incentivizing you to conform to what their personality that you set up at the beginning of the game kind of requires. I mean, there are some other games on Mitu Khandaker's list that I thought were interesting. I mean, she talks about some of the same ones that we always bring up, because Inquisition is on there, one of the Dragon Age games. There's Kitty Powers Matchmaker, which I've never got around to playing, but I'm still quite interested in playing. It looks good. It's kind of like a dating game. And one of the other things on her list of kind of things that you need to do to make a good one of these games is diversity being key. And again, when I first saw this, I thought it was kind of a purely ethical, moralistic thing. But it kind of makes sense that these games are only as good as the characters are diverse. Not from like a representational standpoint of, there should be a character in a wheelchair and there should be characters of different ethnicities, but even just from a psychological standpoint of, if all the characters have the same personality, then there's nothing to watch, right? You're effectively just watching an ant colony. If you think of kind of how stories are driven by conflict, that's the kind of way that sitcoms are set up.
You only get conflict if you have clashing goals, right, and interests.
Like Friends wouldn't be funny if it was just 5 Joey Tribbianis.
I mean, some people would argue
it's not funny anyway. You need to fill in the gaps. But I wanted to talk about a game I played recently as well that I thought did some of these things in an interesting way.
Which game is that?
So recently I played this game called Ctrl.Alt.DEL, which is this kind of cyberpunk game. And it's a video game. Played the demo of it on Steam, and I think if any of this sounds appealing to listeners, you should go and check it out, because I belly laughed at this game multiple times when I was playing it, and it was a bit difficult to get my head around, because it's kind of the Photoshop problem again. It's this precise problem that she's identifying throughout this talk, is that we don't have a standard set of game mechanics for doing this stuff. So a game is always going to suffer a little bit, at least in terms of accessibility, if it's doing something that is too new, right? And that's the problem I had with this game, but it was very, very funny. So the setup is that you are an AI operating in a kind of tower block in a cyberpunk future, and the game mechanics are effectively a deck builder. So you have a deck of cards and you draw a certain amount each time, and then you use them to do actions, and then the turn progresses, and the next turn you draw more cards, and you change that deck of cards throughout the game. But the game is quite abstract in terms of what it's asking you to do, and that's why it was so confusing. But some of the situations that arise from this was so funny. So the setup is you are trying to act on the people in this office. And you are being asked to prank one of them 3 times. And I like this so much because, to me, this is kind of what the cyberpunk genre is about. It's about the social in this kind of media-saturated futuristic. It's not just about, that person's got a robot arm and can shoot a laser, right? It's about, this is a game that's effectively about information brokering and gossip. So you will interact with a character in the office and build up social capital with them by doing things for them, like making food order to a particular place, or getting someone else to come into the room who they want to talk to. And then there are other actions that let you learn about the relationships in the office, and there are actions that allow you to learn about topics that people like and dislike. And there's a big list of topics that people like and dislike. They've just got like 3 slots of things they like and dislike. So you could, for example, prank and annoy someone by making someone in the office go and talk to them about a particular topic that they hate. And this is where the kind of procedurality of the thing really leads to very funny moments, because it might be that you infuriate this person by having someone go and talk to them about New Zealand, because you've discovered they just don't like New Zealand for whatever reason. And it was such a weird concept, because there are all of these social things that we're not used to seeing modelled in games, and particularly not in this way, because what this game is doing is this kind of weird third place where it's not a doll's house where you just watch.
Yeah.
You are interacting. You're acting directly on these characters. Well, not directly, but you're treating these characters as a means to end rather than an end in themselves, right? You are instrumentalizing these characters, and it's a game about being manipulative.
Yeah.
And that is kind of funny as well because it's kind of sadistic and slapstick in a social way, right? And I think the other thing that you could do was learn the food that the character disliked and then have a character that they didn't like bring it to them and try and give it to them.
All right.
And you're just like causing a nervous breakdown in this boss, the manager of this office, by making all these annoying little things happen. But then because you're an AI and you're having to like hack computers to find out information or to get more cards for your scheme.
Yeah.
There's also like a suspicion meter, where the boss might come in a room and see that you keep hacking this particular computer to get information, and that's kind of part of it as well. And it was a flawed game in many ways. It was very difficult to get my head round. But in terms of this kind of genre, it felt like it was doing a very weird thing with it because it's not just like, here's a social situation, the characters are autonomous, watch them.
Yeah.
It's like, here's a social situation, now try and make this thing happen using these very strange interaction mechanics. And I know that this is a genre, or maybe not a genre, but a focus in games that has existed for a long time all over the place, but I just haven't seen much of it, and I'd really like to explore most of it. And I don't know, I definitely think that the examples we saw in this talk are going to make me try and seek out more of these games. I definitely want to play Redshirt. I highly recommend people try Ctrl.Alt.DEL because the demo that I played only had one scenario in, and I kind of want to see what the other scenarios in it are. So all that's left really is to ask people if you've enjoyed hearing us waffle on about how people work and how fake people work in computer games, and all of the variation between those things. Then please give us a review. So whatever listening platform you're on for the podcast, if you can give us a 5-star review, that would be really nice because that makes us more visible. And because we only have a few reviews at this point, I think we will read them out as long as they're not horrible.
Yeah. Say something nice or funny, and we're gonna give you a shout out.
Yeah, and I think maybe once we get to the point where there's like 10 reviews, we might have to be more selective. But while we're still in early days and we only have 2 or 3, I think we can afford to read them all out.
Even the rude ones, maybe.
Yeah.
That is everything we have this month. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.